This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Howdy folks, Carl Jorn here, Pioneer Field Agronomist for Northwest Indiana. I am joined as always by my colleague and co-host, Ben Jacob. Ben, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Carl. It's a little bit of a shock to the system to come back after an extended holiday break, but it was well received, and I got to spend some much needed time with my kids. Did you weather your break as well?
Yeah. No, happy New Year to the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast listeners. As this episode drops on the 11th of January, you're right. It's been a minute since we've been together to visit on the podcast. We left things off with Christmas tree production. The Jorn household, we did well. Had a very good, Christmas holiday and New Year. We little peek behind the curtain. We have a 2.5-year-old that we attempted to potty train over the break. So thoughts and prayers are welcomed. But I think we saw the other side of that. So we're down to just one in diapers at the Jorn household now. So very, very fortunate to spend the quality time with family and friends and enjoy a little bit of time away from the seed business. But here we are, time to pay the bills and start talking about things that matter to growers in the great state of Indiana.
Very much so. So, Carl, you actually floated this idea out, and it's a subject that I'm not, shall we say, classically trained in, but it's a subject that I spend quite a bit of time with. And so this time of year in particular, I spend quite a bit of time with it in the woods. And so Carl brought up that maybe we could talk a little bit about food plots or broader wildlife habitat improvement. But again, not trained in it, just as a personal interest. I have some experience. So Carl and I'll have the conversation today and see what it yields. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Ben, I think as agronomists, as you put it, classically trained in the science of crop production and soil management, we do all, as growers and advisors, have a little bit of a conservationist bone in our body. We can't raise sustainably produced crops, high yielding crops, without having an eye on the conservation of the inputs and the land as we're making some of these management decisions. And so as we were starting off the new year, we thought, well, there's only so many things an agronomist can really talk about from a crop production standpoint without boring everyone to tears. And so we thought that talking about wildlife conservation management and habitat creation and specifically food plots would be a fun place to take things. And so a little different take than the normal type of conversation we have on this program, but thought it would be one folks would enjoy listening to as they get back about their business. So Ben, you said that January, February, you're busy in the woods this time of year. I'm a man that lives on a couple acres in a subdivision just outside of Lafayette, Indiana. So I'm going to play the fool in this conversation and ask the dumb questions. In January, February, everything's pretty well dormant in the woods. And so when I'm looking at managing stuff on my property, I'm pruning trees and I'm getting rid of stuff that I don't want there, some invasive species and things of that nature. What is occupying your time as you're out managing forested or timber property?
Yeah, so it's largely similar. You mentioned food plots, and we'll get into that later, but in the sense that the primary food source for deer in the woods, you're looking at shrubs and the buds on the end of branches, and if you go out and actually spend time looking at browse, you can look at these young saplings. So for me, the reason it's busy is because I have a relatively new property that I'm working on improving the design of, I guess, to make it work for. It's a multi-use property, so not just hunting, but
Sure.
to make it work a little bit better for me. And so that could be anything from clearing trails, because if I'm looking at it, the impact that it's going to have on the deer herd, obviously anything you do in the woods is going to have some impact. And when do I want that to happen? Well, deer season is just wrapped up. We won't see it again until September. So now is a good time to do that. But anything that I trim, anything that I cut goes down on the ground, and that's a food source that the deer didn't have access to before that they can use here as winter marches on. If you get into late February into March and you go walk through most woods, you'll notice that a lot of those saplings are chewed off, and the food source can get pretty lean that time of year. Depending on how broad you want to take the conversation, this is also the time of year that I would do things like hinge cutting, or just trying to what hinge cutting is. I suppose I should define that. It's I wouldn't recommend an inexperienced sawyer doing it himself, but you cut partially through say a 6 to 8 inch tree, about head high, and you just let that hinge over, so it's still connected to the roots, and that'll lay down on the ground, and it provides an immediate food source. But also, once it lays down on the ground, all those branches want to grow straight up again, and you can get a really dense cover system off of just a handful of trees that way. If you're looking at broader habitat design, you can use that to steer where the deer are going to go. I mean, you can get really dense to where they can't go through it, and you can really kind of steer where your deer herd's going to move by doing that, and provide them cover and provide them a food source that they didn't necessarily have before. So that in a nutshell is what's going to take most of my time in the woods this time of a year. And I do want to put a caveat out there with that, as somebody who does leverage timber sales. If you're not good at identifying trees, and you decide to hinge cut, I'd maybe consult somebody that can. You say, hey, well, this is a white oak, this is a black walnut. These are your high value species. These are lower value species that are just going to go, into pallet, whatever that might be. If you're going to hinge cut, let's leave these because they're going to have value in the future. Before you go out there and go tackle high value.
Go tackle your mulberry trees and things of that nature, as opposed to like you said. Okay. It's interesting. Then you talk about how you can kind of manage the movement of the wildlife population by creating that habitat design. As somebody that did not grow up a hunter but grew up an angler, you're kind of working from the opposite standpoint. That the landscape, the lay of the water, and the bed of the river, the stream, the pond, the lake that you're working with, that's established, and so all you can do is kind of look for what the cover is, how the depth of water changes, how the what the material is on the base of of the water, and kind of use that to identify where the fish may be moving in the time of year and how that's different. But there's a lot of commonalities. You just don't have as much control as somebody that's fishing from shore or fishing from a boat as you do as a property owner and somebody that can manage the landscape.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Carl, and it's probably worth backing up that I'm not just going in the woods and cutting things down kind of willy-nilly. I never hang on a property until I've hunted it at least for a year, and I want to know kind of what the deer movement is, and identify if there's existing thickets and bedding areas, and there's an existing movement that maybe I just want to direct a little bit more. That's a whole lot easier than trying to bend the property to what's convenient with you, and it's often, if you try to do that without having the broad overview of what's already there, you're going to find limited success. So what I would do, I guess if we're going in, we might as well go all the way in. So try and familiarize myself with deer movement on a property, right? Identify those existing thickets, bedding areas that are going to hold deer. So you really, on a property, you need food, you need cover, and you need water. Those are the three things that are an absolute must to hold any wildlife. Right? So if I can identify where those things are already and kind of design the property around that, the other thing that I want to look at is elevation. Right? If you're in southern Indiana like me, where you have some rolling hills or you have some valleys that you can work, deer, especially bucks, are they want to be able to smell and they want to be able to see, while also having cover, right? So
Mm-hmm.
some of the best bedding areas are going to be if you have a piece of high ground that can be real thick. You're if you can use that to your advantage, it's certainly something that you should. And the last thing around that is access. You can build the best habitat in the world, but if you can't get in it without scaring all the deer off,
Yeah, sure.
there's utility to it. So there's a good point that you evaluating what is there, the same thing you would do in a lake or a pond that you have limited resources to improve. That's really where you have to start at with habitat design, in my opinion, as well.
Interesting. So as we kind of cross over to, the intersection here with land management from tillable acres and food plots, specifically with deer in mind, I understand this could be somewhat of a controversial topic, but what is a strategy that one might employ when it comes to trying to take advantage of some of those acres that they have and utilize them for wildlife management, specifically with deer in mind?
Yeah. So I think with many things, like with many things in life, start broadly with what your goal is. I have a neighbor that I help out a little bit, that she does not allow anybody to hunt on her property. She doesn't have a problem with hunting per se. But she really likes seeing deer, and it's a mostly wooded property, and you have to look at your goal too with where you're at, where I'm at, where we have plenty of tillable ground with kind of interspersed with wood is a much different conversation than, say, as we get closer to the national forest, where you have acres and acres that are wooded, where you're not going to be able to rely as heavily on that ag ground. So for me, basically the months of let's just say from June, if we have a late spring, all the way through to September, the deer are going to have a really good food source somewhere close to their core zone. The amount that a deer is going to travel is somewhat limited. Some bucks will roam miles, but for the most part, they're going to have a core area, and they want to stay there, and they want to have cover, food, and water all right there without having to travel too much to get to that. So start with what your goal is. Do you just want to see more deer around, or are you trying to build a herd on a property that doesn't have a herd yet? Then look at the available food sources that are out there. If you're fortunate, like most people listening to this podcast, I assume are, to have some actual farmed acreage around there's going to be a reliable food source through the summer. So it starts with what do you want to do on your property to help hold deer, and when do you want to hold them? So oftentimes what I see people doing, and I did the same thing when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, was that I've got this little chunk where there's more light reaching the forest floor than in other spots. I'm going to rake the leaves out. I'm going to go buy whatever throw and grow I can buy at Rural King, throw it out there, dust it over with a stick and hope for the best. Sure. And no surprise, that yielded pretty poor results, right? So if assuming that you put some strategy into it, and you've actually thought about your layout and identified where your food plots are going to go, from that it's a pretty agronomic practice, right? Start with the soil test. Now, when you send your soil test to the lab, you're going to get recommendations back, right, on what those levels should be. For potassium and phosphorus, it's going to way overestimate what you need for your food plot. Right? You're not growing a seed crop. You're growing a forage crop. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't fertilize for that, but you don't necessarily have to. The big one that is an absolute must is get the pH right. And a lot of places in the forest where you're trying to put a food plot, the pH is going to be way off. It's going to take quite a bit of lime to get it there. So, so that's the same practice that we'd be going. Identify what crop you're going to, what its nutritional needs are, and amend the soil to make that right. And that is the number one thing for people that want to put food plots out that haven't. If you skip that step, it's going to yield limited results. If you do get anything to grow, the deer are going to overbrowse it before it's ever of any utility to you. So, I mean, that's pretty straightforward agronomically,
Yeah.
right? Pick your.
But
Go
then
ahead.
for another agronomist listening to that, you think about how a prairie soil was formed versus how a timber soil was formed, and how you have those natural differences, like you said, in pH. If you got that forested floor, you have that annual leaf layer that comes down and it decomposes, and that's an acid rich layer. And so, like you said, it takes far more lime to correct that versus the prairie soil. It's got a far deeper root system that can kind of help scavenge those nutrients with each annual, die off of the roots, and has far more organic matter deeper in the soil profile. And so it's kind of got it's got a better base there that doesn't take as much to correct. So that totally jives if I'm just thinking about how soils are formed. And as you stated, you're putting these food plots out where you're trying to create that hot spot of food to produce as a forage crop, as opposed to, I guess a feed crop in that standpoint. So that makes total sense that one would take a look at lime as step one in the reconciliation process to make for your best possible food source for those wildlife. That checks out. So you got that. Then what? After we've done our soil test, we've done that remediation by putting some lime out there. Where are we taking things from here?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately I'm going to have to chase a squirrel that I should have covered earlier that popped in my head while you were talking about that. As you're looking for locations to do this, if you're fortunate enough to have a bunch of black walnut growing on your property, congratulations, you have one of the higher value timber species. But black walnut also has an autotoxicity to it, where it, if you didn't know, both the leaves and there's a root exudate, I believe, that will suppress the growth of other species around them. So, not ideal for putting in a food plot, regardless of what you do as far as soil amendments. You're going to have a tough go on that one. So just we'll throw that out there.
Great call out. I think for the trivia fun fact of the day, I think that exudate is jugalone. Maybe I could be mispronouncing it. Jugalone, something of that nature, I think, is what the term is called. So, but squirrel chased. So avoid your black walnuts if you're trying to put that forage crop out of around that area of the woods. So we're moved away from there. We've got our soil that's been managed for putting the seed out there. So now what? You said drive over to Rural King and pick up what bags are we picking up here, or is that what we're supposed to avoid now?
Well, nothing against Rural King, and there's some food plot mixes there that you can probably find great success with, but determine what time of year you want to hold deer in that area, and then we'll decide what we're going to plant there. So, I mentioned that say June to September, we have a good food source. And I really primarily focus on fall food sources at October through January, is where I want to supply a high quality forage for them. But I also want to fill that gap as winter's breaking and before we have green in the field. So I will take a subset, and you can do it with blends. It works out okay doing it with blends, but I try to have some cereal rye or even some winter wheat out there, so there's something that's going to green up early in the spring to get to some nutrition in those deer as they're coming out of winter. And it's a really critical time. And if we have a tough winter that's delayed a little bit, and those cuttings that I talked about earlier also help fill that in a little bit. But so what time of year you're trying to feed your deer, and then pick what you want to put outside of that. Like I said, I use wheat and rye for kind of that spring, to fill in that spring. And then for the fall, I rely almost entirely on brassicas, about turnips and radishes and things like that. Occasionally I should back up. I want to plant these towards the end of July, the fall food plots.
Okay.
And let them get as let them get as mature as they can before the first frost. Now, the reason I like brassicas is because they're very hardy to cold weather. You could in theory accomplish this just with soybeans if you wanted to, but the first frost is going to be pretty tough on them. With brassicas, some of those can survive down to 10-ish degrees in my experience.
How about that?
And when they frost off, the deer will still eat them. They'll, something changes, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, but after the frost, there's something with the carbohydrates, and a turnip will be sweeter after it's been frosted. The same thing, surprisingly, with Brussels sprouts. If you grow them in your garden, a light frost on them will make them sweeter and less bitter. Now, a heavy frost is a different story, but a light frost can improve the taste on them. So,
and to chase the squirrel, it's kind of the opposite, right? In hot weather, if you planted like a last round of radishes in your garden, and they're growing through the hottest point in the growing season, it seems like they've got a little bit more zip on them than what they would at the front or at the back end of the growing season.
Yeah. So definitely they'll get a little bit more bitter, and so it's a labor of love for me. So everything that I put out is primarily annual, that you can be very successful with planting a clover, a perennial clover crop that's going to come back every year. You're still going to need to apply some maintenance to it. The step that I haven't gotten into yet is weed control. Now,
sure.
you're not going to be able to spray really any of this, right, that you put out. There are some things that you could. So, if you can go back and listen to our weed control discussions on row crops, and it's not too dissimilar in the fact that start clean, and try and get the crop you're growing to outcompete and canopy out the weeds. So the reason I bring that up now, if you are doing something like a clover or an alfalfa, you're going to need to manage the weeds that will come up in those across the years. And that's really simple to do. You're going to have to mow it a couple of times and mow out the clover. The clover will tolerate a mowing.
Right.
Okay. And some of the weed species that'll come up in them won't. So, it can be that simple, and you can have good results if you can put a clover crop out once, mow it late spring and early fall, so they have some good regrowth, and you'll find success with that. You're not going to have as good a food source, say, in November and December as you would with something like radishes. So that, honestly, that's my goal, is to fill out the winter months. And when deer season comes in, those radish plots can be very productive. They're going to hold a lot of deer. Now, if you have a small property, maybe one food plot's appropriate. If you have a larger property, you need to spread it out. If you really want to hold a lot of deer, you're going to be limited by the number of bedding areas and the number of food areas that you have, because the does will group up into families. We've all seen a half dozen or a dozen does in a field together. There's a limit to how big those individual families can grow, but perhaps more importantly, two doe families will not bed or feed in the same area. They'll fight. They'll compete for that. So if you want to hold a ton of deer on your property, and I'm not saying should be a goal everywhere, it's not necessarily my goal in this, but you need as many food plots as many food sources as you have doe families. So for me, I focus less on the number of deer that I'm holding on the property, and providing a good and diverse food source, starting from the pre-route all the way through the end of winter. Right. So that, broadly in a nutshell, is my approach. But since this is the agronomy podcast, if we take it back, let's amend the soil, control the weeds. You can sometimes get away with just broadcasting and covering it up. In fact, what I do in most cases, I've got a little 8-foot disc and an old Ford tractor that was my grandpa's, and I disc the tar out of something, and then I broadcast whatever I'm planting on it, and then I disc it again to cover it back up. I try to play the weather and stay ahead of a rain, so I can get a little bit quicker germination out of that. In some places, I steal my wife's, she's got a portable electric fence for sheep as we rotate pastures. I steal that, and I'll go put it up around my food plot to keep the deer out of it when it's real young and tender, to get it up. But again, it's all on how much time you want to spend messing around in the woods, I suppose, whether or not that's worth it. So yeah, broadly speaking, there it is.
Okay, no, that was cool. As somebody that's a total novice to this discussion, I found that interesting. The things that I think about is, you've got that natural landscape and how you're leveraging the terrain differences, like you said, the existing vegetation, and then introducing some biodiversity, through some crops that have been bred to withstand differences in the climate and the time of year that they're being raised, and so they might be a little more resilient to outcompete that natural landscape for that short window of time that you're asking them to set roots and shoots and get up and get going. They probably wouldn't be all that competitive if we asked them to reproduce and try to colonize that area, but certainly for the given task that they've been given, they're definitely set up to introduce some biodiversity, which is going to be like you'd said, some new food sources. I would assume with that, you're going to introduce some more, other species in the area. There may be some, some small mammals, or maybe some birds or something like that would follow what the deer, not taking in and scavenge, in that area too. So on the whole, managing that landscape for deer is going to be an improvement for the existing wildlife too. Is my speculation as somebody that's not a wildlife conservationist by any means, but some things that go through my head reflecting on this.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that cover and transition are important. The more you're right, there are a lot of different animals that are going to utilize that food source, and if you're doing things to improve cover for deer, you're also improving cover for a number of small animals, and having that, again, the bedding, food, and water all close together, you make life a lot easier on them as well.
Sure. Well, I found this interesting. I'm sure that a number of our listeners are like me and hadn't really given this discussion a whole lot of thought prior to today. Is there anything that we want to leave the good folks with on this subject that we didn't have a chance to cover that you'd like?
I think that for me, I see a lot of opportunity for guys that it's not necessarily a bottom line opportunity, but it can fall into stewardship of the land if you look at it like that. There are things that you can do to improve it, and honestly, where I got started in this was looking at timber stand improvements on some property that I bought that had a poor timber stand, and noticed some of the benefits of opening up to that understory sunlight. And the timber ground is not going to be as productive, right, financially as the ag ground, but there's still value there that you can manage, and it's a longer play, right? I'm managing this for my kids at this point, right? It's not something that I'm going to realize, but I do think that it falls into land stewardship, and there's a lot of people who want to recreate outdoors, and they're to really creative folks. There may be opportunity there if you provide the appropriate recreation space too. So it's just another area of agriculture that is probably sometimes overlooked, that is not that much effort to apply a little bit of focus to if you have some time, and especially the winter months.
Absolutely. We'll leave it there, folks. As we work our way through the front months in the calendar year, if you have any topics that are passions of your own, or subjects that we have not covered here in recent memory, please give us that feedback so we can make sure that we cover those topics. We'd be happy to introduce some diversity to the podcast like we've done here over the last couple episodes, just to keep things fresh and interesting, and but also want to make sure we're not running afoul of covering the basics and all things agronomy and seed selection wise and things of that nature. So with that, we'll wrap up the January 11th edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. Ben, for folks that want to follow along with you messing around in the woods over the next month or two, where may they do so?
Yep, you can follow me on Twitter at the Ben Jacob, or on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Carl?
If you want to see what I'm doing in Northwest Indiana or the greater Lafayette area, you can do so on Twitter at CJorn, that's CJOERN, or on Facebook at CJorn Agronomy. With that, we'll leave you with some thoughts to ponder. Maybe you'll join Ben out on those timber acres here in the next month or two, managing your landscape for more biodiversity, a little bit better habitat for our native wildlife. And if not, we'll catch you in the recliner or in the cab as you're checking out the next edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.